He does know what he's talking about, Teru added. He has a clear assessment of the contradictions in the inhabitants of Iran, who, while they feel a deep need for warmth, which brings them together, at the same time cannot surrender to it entirely because of the subconscience that keeps them apart. You know very well you cannot trust your neighbor, that he is quite capable of giving you the plague without knowing it, and taking advantage of your lowered guard to infect you. When, like Kotar, you have spent your days looking for possible police spies in everyone, even people who like being with you, cannot understand the feeling. One can very well sympathize with those people who live with the idea that from one day to the next the plague might touch them on the shoulder, and that it is perhaps getting ready to do so, just for one of the congratulating oneself on still being safe and sound, as far as one can be. Kotar is at ease in terror, but because he has felt all of this before him, I think that he cannot really feel how cruel this uncertainty is. In short, with us who have not yet died from the plague, he is aware of his freedom and his life are on the brink of destruction at any moment. But since he has himself lived in terror, he considers it normal and others should experience it in their turn. More precisely, terror seems to him a less heavy burden than if he were all alone. This is what he is wrong, and he has harder to understand than some others. But after all, that is why he deserves more than others. That is why that we should try and understand him. Finally, Teru accounted ends to the story, which illustrates the particular awareness that came at the same time as Kotar and the victims of the plague. The story captures the difficult atmosphere of the time, which is why the narrator attaches some importance to it. They have gone to the Municipal Opera House, where they were playing Ophelia and Euphrates. Kotar had invited Teru. The company was one that had arrived in spring of the plague year and gave some performances in our town. Trapped by the disease, they found themselves obliged, with the agreement of the opera house, to keep on giving the same performance once a week. Thus, for some months now, every Friday, the Municipal Theater raged to a melloperative sigh of operas and the powerless plead of Euphrates. However, the opera was still a success with the public and continued to take a lot of money at the box office. Sitting in the most expensive seats, Kotar and Teru looked out over the audience, packed with the most elegant of their fellow citizens. Those who came into the auditorium obviously made an effort not to spoil their entrance. The silhouettes stood out clearly beneath the dazzling lights on the apron stage and had moved from one row to another, bowing gracefully while the musicians tuned their instruments. And in a slight hum of polite conversation, the man recovered the self-confidence they had lost a few hours earlier in the black streets of the town. Evening dress drove away the plague. Throughout the first act, Ophelius sighed and moaned without difficulty. A few women in Grecian tunics commanded elegantly at his plight. Love was sung about the little airs. Audience responded with voluntarily warm applause. Hardly anyone knows that his aria in the second act. Ophelius introduced some unscheduled turmoils and put rather too much pathos in his voice when singing to muster the underworld, and he began with him to be moved to tears. When he let spit a jerk movement in the most sophisticated contradiction, this to be the touch of stiflation. and the importance of the singer's interpretation of the role. It was not until the great duo of Euphrates and of Ophelius and Euphrates in the third act. This is the moment when he lost Euphrates. The audience showed some surprise, and the thought the singer had been expecting a stir among the spectators, or more probably the thought that the murmur rising from the stall confirmed that he was still feeling. He chose that moment to walk towards the footlights in a gratuitous manner, arms wide and bow-legged in a casual custom, and collapsed in the midst of the 18th century parcel decor, and had always been imported, but which in the eye of the audience now became so for the first time that the most dreadful way. The same moment the orchestra stopped playing and people in the stalls got up and slowly started to leave the theater. Firstly, in silence, as one does not leave a church and the service is over in the frugality chamber after the visit, the women gathered their skirts, leaving with lowered heads, and the men grinding the female companion by the elbow and steering them past the folding seats. But little by little the movement sped up and the whispering turned into an exclamation. The crowd poured out of the direction of the exits, hurrying through them, eventually pushing and shouting. Guitar and Theroux, who were merely rise from their feet, remained alone before the image of what their life was at the time. The plague on the stage in person of a performer, like a limp puppet, and the auditorium luxury that had become useless in the form of fans and lace stools, left behind by a reddish push of the seats. In the early days of September, Rambert worked consequently behind Raoul. He merely asked for the day's leave when he was to meet Gonzalez and the two young men in the front of the boys' school. That day at noon, Gonzalez and the journalist saw the two lads laughing as they approached. They said that they'd been unlucky last time, but it was only to be expected. In any case, it wasn't their week on guard duty. They'd have to wait until next week. Then they could start all over again. Rambert said that was certainly how he would put it. So Gonzalez suggested meeting the following Monday, but this time they would lodge Rambert in Marcel and Louis' house. We'll arrange a meeting, you and I, and then if I'm not there, you can directly go to their place. We'll tell you where they live. But Marcel or Louis said that the point was the simplest thing, to take the comrade there at once. If he wasn't fussy, there'd be enough to eat for all four of them. In this way, he'd know how things stood. Gonzalez said that it was a very good idea, and they set off towards the port. Marcel and Louis lived in the outskirts of the maritime district, near the house in which looked out over the front. Theirs was a little Spanish house with thick walls, painted wooden shutters, and the bare, shady rooms. The young men's mother, an old Spanish woman with a smile and lots of wrinkles, served them rice. Gonzalez was amazed because there was already a shortage of rice in town. We have ways at the gates, said Marcel. Rambert ate and drank, and Gonzalez said as he was a real friend, and the journalist could only think of the weeks he had ahead of him. In fact, he had 2 weeks, because the shifts of the guards' duties were extended to a fortnight to reduce the numbers of teams. And during the fortnight, Rambert worked incessantly and continuously from dawn to night, as it were with his eyes shut. He would go to bed late at night and sleep a heavy sleep. Sudden transition of idleness to the exhausting labor left him more or less without dreams and without strength. He spoke little about his forthcoming escape. One notable fact, after a week he confided in the doctor for the first time. The previous night he got drunk. On coming out to the bar, he suddenly had an impression that his groin was swelling and his arms were stiff around his armpits. He thought it was the plague. But the only thing he could think of doing at that point was something which he agreed with Raoul was not reasonable, was to run to the highest part of the town, therefore from a little square from which you could still not see the sea, but could at least see a bit of the sky. He called to his wife with one great cry across the town wall. When he got home, he found no sign of infection on himself, and was not particularly proud of the succumbing to the sun panic. Rayu said that he understood his acting like that very well. In any case, he said, it's a sort of thing you might want to do. Monsieur Othon talked to me about you this morning, Rayu added. Suddenly, just as Rambert was leaving, he asked me if I knew you, and then I advised him. I said, not a frequent smuggler. People are starting to notice him. What does that mean? It means that you better hurry. Thank you, said Rambert, shaking the doctor's hand. At the door, he suddenly turned around. Rayu saw that for the first time since the outbreak of the plague, he was smiling. So why don't you just stop leaving me? You could if you wanted to. Rayu shook his head in a usual way and said that this was a matter for Rambert. He had chosen happiness, and Rayu could not argue against it. He felt unable to judge what was right or wrong in the matter. So in that case, why are you telling me to hurry? It was Rayu's turn to smile. Perhaps it's because I, too, would like to do something for happiness. The next day, they did not discuss anything, but they worked together. The following week, Rambert finally settled in the little Spanish house. They made up the bed for him in the living room. Since the young men did not come home for meals, and since it had been told to go out as little as possible, he lived alone most of the time. They made conversation with the old mother. She was dry, energetic, dressed in black, with a wrinkled brown face under the clear gray hair. She kept quiet and would smile, her eyes sparkling when she looked at Rambert. At other times, she would ask if he wasn't afraid of taking the plague to his wife. He thought that this risk they'd have to take, but the minute once a while if he would stay in town, there was a chance of them being separated forever. She's nice, the old woman asked with a smile. Very nice. Pretty? I think so. Ah, that's why, she said. Rambert thought about it. Of course that's why, but it couldn't be the only reason. Don't you believe in God? Said the old woman. Attended Mass every morning? Rambert admitted that he didn't, and she said again that this is why. You have to go back to her. You're right. Otherwise, what's left for you? The rest of the time, Rambert walked around and around within the naked, rough-cast walls, stroking the fan nails and to them, and else counting the wooden balls of the fragile around the tablecloth. In the evening, the two boys came home. They said very little except to tell him that it was not yet time. After dinner, Marcel played the guitar and drank the Annecy liqueur. Rambert seemed to be thinking. On Wednesday, Marcel came back saying, It's tomorrow evening at midnight. Be ready. One of the two men who kept guard with them had caught the plague, and the other one, who usually shared a bedroom, was with him and under observation. So for 2 or 3 days, Marcel and Louis would be alone. During the night, they would make the final arrangements. The next day, it would be possible. Are you pleased? Said the old woman. Rambert said that he was. He was thinking of other things. The following day, the sky was heavy and the air humid and stiffing. There was bad news of the plague. However, the old Spanish woman remained calm. There is sin in the world, she said, so naturally. Like Marcel and Louis, Rambert was stripped to the waist. But whenever he moved, sweat ran between his shoulder blades and across his chest. In a half-lit of the house in the closed shutters, their torsos looked down and shiny. Rambert walked about the house without speaking. Suddenly, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he got dressed and said he was going out. Watch out, said Marcel. It's for midnight. Everything's set up. Rambert went to see Rayu. The doctor's mother told him that he could be found at the hospital in the upper town. Around the guard post, some crowds were constantly growing round and round. Moving on, said the guardsmen and the protesting eyes. The crowd did move on, but in circles. There's nothing to see, said the guardsman, and sweat soaking through his jacket. Everyone agreed, but they stayed even so. Despite the lethal heat, Rambert showed the guardsman a pass, and the man pointed to Theroux's office. The door opened on the courtyard, and he met Father Panelou coming out of the office. In the dirty little white room, smelling the disinfecting and damp sheets, Theroux was sitting behind a black-lined desk with his shirt sleeves rolled up, dabbing the sweat in the crook of his arm with a handkerchief. "Still here?" he asked. "Yes. I'd like to talk to Rayu. He's on the ward, but would be better if you could fix it without him." "Why?" "He's overworked. I'm sparing him as much as I can." Rambert looked at Theroux. He lost weight in his eyes and the features were blurred and fatigued. His strong shoulders were hunched. Someone knocked on the door. The male nurse came in wearing a white mask. He put down a bundle of filling cards on Theroux's desk, and his voice, muffled by the mask, said 6 and went out. Theroux looked at the journalist and fanned out the cards to show him. "Nice cards, aren't they?" "Well, no, actually they are the people who died last night." His poor head wrinkled and gathered up the bundle of cards. "The only thing we've got left is statistics." Theroux got up, supporting himself against the table. "Are you leaving soon?" "Tonight at midnight." Theroux said that he was glad that Rambert had better look out after himself. "Do you really mean that?" Theroux shrugged his shoulders. "At my age, you've got to mean what you say. It's too tiring to lie." Theroux, the journalist, said, "I'd like to see the doctor, excuse me." "I know, he's more human than I am. Let's go." "That's not it," Rambert said awkwardly. Then he stopped. Theroux looked at him and smiled suddenly. They went down the little corridor with the walls painted light green, where the lights was like that in an aquarium. Just before they got to the double glass door behind which one could see the strange shadows moving, Theroux made Rambert go into a very small room with cupboards all around the walls. He opened one and took 2 gauze masks out of the sterilizer, offered one to Rambert, and asked him to put it on. The journalist asked if this served a purpose, and Theroux said no, but that was inspired confidence in others. They pushed open the glass door, and the ward in the huge room with the windows hermetically sealed, and despite the weather, high up on the walls they were humming machines that kept the air moving, their twisted parcels fanning the clotted, overheated air above 2 rows of gray beds. From all sides rose dull moans and sharp cries and merged into a single monstrous wail. Men dressed in white were slowly walking around. The cruel light came from the high barred windows. Rambert felt uncomfortable in the ghastly heat of the room and had difficulty recognizing Rayu standing over the groaning figure. The doctor was making incisions in the patient's groin, while 2 women nurses on each side of the bed kept his legs apart. And Rayu got up and dropped the implants all into a tray with the assistant was holding and stayed motionless, looking at the man whose wounds were being dressed.